English translation. 602nd contact Saturday, the 22nd of November 2014, 14:47 hours.
You're already here. Today the correction went quickly again, but now be welcomed and greeted. It's just something other than telepathic after all.
It really is, so I would like to greet you personally and thank you for your welcome.
Before the correction, I watched together with Bernadette a nature film on television, in which also a short sequence, about 3-4 seconds, of a three-toed woodpecker was shown, but unfortunately much too short and without description. Because I used to be interested in ornithology, I know that these birds are rare in Switzerland and live in spruce forests, but they are more common in northern Europe and elsewhere in coniferous forests. The bird is about 20 to 22 centimeters tall, and the plumage of the barely colorful woodpecker has no red or pink tones. They build their caves in spruce, and when resin flows out of the spruce by building the cave, then the three-toed woodpeckers keep beating at it, although ornithological science does not know the reason for resin eating. Since, as I know, you are extensively concerned with earthly ornithology, I would like to ask you whether you perhaps know the reason why these woodpeckers eat spruce resin. And if you can say anything else about this bird species, then that would also be interesting.
The three-toed woodpecker, Latin Picoides tridactylus, is one of the 12 species of the genus Picoides in the subfamily of true woodpeckers. The northern European occurrence of the three-toed woodpecker is not very large. And besides, this woodpecker type is somewhat smaller than a colored woodpecker, and it also lacks the red in the feather coloring. It is native to old coniferous forests rich in deadwood, where it feeds mainly on wood-dwelling beetle larvae. He is a pronounced bark beetle specialist, which is why he prefers unkempt spruce forests with plenty of dead wood. The three-toed woodpecker is therefore widespread in the boreal forest of the entire Palearctic, and it lives in the entire northern belt of coniferous forests of central Scandinavia and of northeastern Poland, the Baltic states, as well as eastward to Kamchatka, Sakhalin, and Hokkaido. Isolated from the closed spread area, there are also occurrences in West China, above all in the Tian Shan, as also in some mountain situations of Europe. In Central and Southeastern Europe, it cannot be found very often in its entire montane or subalpine range, and the presence of the three-toed woodpecker is often overlooked. Its population is actually small, but nevertheless not endangered. And with regard to your question as to why the 13-toed woodpeckers, as well as various other birds, animals and creatures, by the way, are amusing themselves with tree resins, this is because it is a completely natural detoxification of the body. Birds, animals also feed on living beings and plants that are not always in the best state of health, which means that they are badly fed, with harmful environmental influences also contributing to the fact that the bodies and organs are attacked by bacteria and parasites, which have to be eradicated again. And this happens, as in the case of the three-toed woodpecker, by supplying the organism with tree resin, which the metabolism processes into a healing substance, whereby the form of life remains healthy or is freed from certain sufferings. All bird genera and species, as well as all animals and all gems, and of course also humans, have their own detoxification facility, such as the organs liver, kidneys, and skin, which carry away harmful substances. However, if they take over, then the organism becomes susceptible to diseases, which must therefore be counteracted, which happens especially with the three-toed woodpecker by eating tree resin.
Interesting, thanks for the explanation. Tree resins are also used by humans as a remedy. My father always made 2 waxes, mixing fir resin and oil to make the resin supple, which could then be applied to wounds and heal them. There are many tree resins that have an antibacterial effect. In fact, all resins are antibacterial and fungicidal, which is their natural sense, because with their own resin the trees protect themselves when they suffer injuries. They also protect themselves against fungal infestation and infections with their resin, as mine and your father have already explained to me. Mastic resin, for example, has even been used for the preservation of wine for thousands of years, as for example still today for the retsina, which I tasted in Greece. Olibanum and frankincense is also strongly antibacterial. There are ointments with frankincense, but also frankincense capsules for ingestion, which have anti-inflammatory effects, as I know from my own experience. On the whole, however, I think that resins from toxic plants and trees should not be used directly, but only products produced by pharmacology. By the way, the ancient myrrh has also been known since ancient times. Myrrh is the resin of 2 or 3 species of the balsam tree and can prevent infections by viruses and fungi. Myrrh also played a role in the birth of Emmanuel, in which 4 wise men, who came from afar, brought precious resins and oils for him. One of the 4 wise men was an educated physician, whatever that may have been at that time, who brought along a tree resin, the preservative benzoin resin, as well as the medically relevant sandarak or resin of the limb cypress, whose scent has a strong effect on the vegetative nervous system. Benzoin is a traditional medicine that is used as an antiseptic, for example from Java to India for colds, coughs and sore throats, but also as a medicine against urinary tract infections, as I learned in India from Swami Dharmawara, when I studied at the Ashoka Ashram in Marauli, where I also treated people and animals.
That's why they called you Dr. Saab, but also Snake Catcher Saab, because you also caught cobras, vipers, and scorpions. And because you also had 2 rhesus monkeys, which you took with you to Switzerland, you were also called Monkey Man and Monkey Saab, but also Flying Saucer Man, because you often walked around the ashram area with Asket and you were watched, as was her aircraft when she came to visit you.
That was a good time back then, and I like to remember it. Phobol Cheng, the niece of the ashram monk Swami Dharmawara, was about 10 years old at that time. A few years after my departure from Ashoka Ashram, she emigrated with her brother and her uncle, Dharmawara, to the USA, where Phobol played a role at the UN. Wendell Stevens met her in New York, where she told him about Asket, her beam ship, and me, what she had seen and experienced in the ashram in Marauli. She came to visit me twice in the center, but unfortunately I haven't heard from her for a long time.
I also think that you like to remember this time, which is why I can understand that you have good memories of this time. Now, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that I checked the original records of the months July to October and noticed that in one of your contact report printouts, an entire section relating to the Ebola epidemic was not printed, but that this section is recorded in our original contact conversation record. And in addition, I would like to say that you already spoke in the 1950s and also later about the fact that new epidemics will appear, which in the meantime has repeatedly proved to be effective truth. Then what has appeared so far will not be the end. Unfortunately, this was overlooked during our joint correction work, which was probably due to the fact that, on the one hand, we distracted ourselves with a short conversation during the correction work itself, and, on the other hand, I used writing copies that you printed out and had in your workroom, which Njana had provided for me. After today's conversation, you can retrieve the missing information separately and record it.
We shouldn't be distracted by anything else, and I think it was clumsy to use a transcript copy from my computer, because it happens again and again that sentences or whole sections simply aren't printed. But we do not know why this is happening either, but I will recall and record what is missing. But what you have now said with regard to the epidemics that were announced by the predictions and that their end will not yet be at the present time, that hits the nail on the head, because further epidemics threaten mankind, whereby these change in the course of time again and again into other forms. Therefore, if a vaccine and a drug are found that are really effective against a disease, then they become worthless again against further mutations of the disease. But that is not all, because even old epidemics such as the plague and bird flu, etc., will appear again very often because they were not completely eradicated and consequently flare up again and again. And also these old rampantly spreading diseases, which are becoming active again, bring forth new mutations against which again no vaccines and no medicines exist. Consequently, again, many human beings will die before effective vaccines and medicines can be found again. In addition, the World Health Organization and experts always treat the risk of infection from diseases and epidemics in a disdainful manner and trivialize everything, thus misleading the populations of all countries as to the real risk of infection.
This is indeed the case. And I therefore think that my statement was important when I said something about the risk of infection in connection with the Ebola epidemic at the 598th official contact meeting on this subject.
Of course. Another question I have is one relating to the ECOPOP initiative, which I consider to be completely crazy, inappropriate, and even for the Swiss economy as a whole, and for the population as a whole, idiotic and ill-considered in terms of the effective facts. In addition, the question whether you already made a future view, whether this imbecile initiative is accepted or rejected. I believe that it should be rejected for the good of the economy and the people.
In fact, I have tried to find out what the outcome of the election on the 30th of November will be like. Negative for the initiators, who really do not consider all the facts that need to be considered, because in their short-sightedness, they are not in a position to recognize reality and its truth.
Well, then I'm already writing a corresponding article in advance for a special bulletin, which will probably be published in February, and which I will add to my words here right away.
Facts about the ECOPOP initiative.
If you look at the whole of the voting initiative launched by ECOPOP, then everything was a very bad, crazy, and completely careless voting initiative, which was unusually irresponsible and even stupid for Switzerland, its people, and for humanity. If the initiative had been adopted, the consequences would have been very serious for the entire Swiss economy, and also for the population, and for foreigners seeking help who are at risk of losing their lives, as well as for skilled workers, and above all for AHV recipients and persons in need of long-term care. The initiative was intended to introduce a rigid immigration quota in Switzerland, whereby the constant growth of the resident population was also to be limited to a maximum of 0.2% per year, with the result that a large number of necessary workers for the entire Swiss economy would no longer be allowed to enter Switzerland and would no longer be allowed to work in the country. This would have included returning Swiss nationals abroad, both male and female, as well as foreigners who are married and their children. Of course, this would also include those asylum seekers who need asylum in Switzerland for reasons that are effectively life-threatening for them. The second goal was the restructuring of development cooperation, which meant that 10% of the total budget was to be used for voluntary family planning measures in order to reduce the birth rate worldwide, with hair-raising fantasies being voiced about the distribution of condoms in developing countries. As far as the labor force for the economy is concerned, Swiss economic history has always shown that the necessary labor and specialists have always been recruited abroad. First in Italy, Germany, then in Spain, Portugal, Turkey, and India, as well as in Yugoslavia, Poland, the USA, and various other countries. This need for foreign workers and specialists would undoubtedly still have been necessary, even if the weak-minded ECOPOP initiative had been adopted, if the sensible Swiss people had allowed themselves to be hoodwinked. If this had been assumed to be a stupid, brain-teasing suggestion, employers would have been forced to simply hire more people as short-term residents from abroad, although even today in Switzerland these are legally much worse off than permanent residents, which corresponds to unparalleled human unworthiness, but which neither disturbs the employers nor the rulers and does not make them feel guilty. The truth is that people with a short-term residence permit have to live in constant fear of losing their right of residence if they lose their job and having to leave the country. If the initiative had been adopted, This would mean that even more families would be torn apart because the ECOPOP nonsense could deny spouses and children the right of residence altogether. Seen in this actual way, ECOPOP considers migrants to be only second-class people who are less well paid. Migrants have long since become an inescapable part of Switzerland, and they all make a very important contribution to Switzerland's economic and cultural wealth. However, ECOPOP obviously does not recognize this, because to the contrary, instead of promoting integration, migrants are made scapegoats for homemade problems. A fact which leads to the fact that hostility towards foreigners, religions and foreigners is stirred up in such a way that not only misguided and misoriented adults, but already children and adolescents show a hostility of this kind, that they full of hatred and without hesitation insult foreigners, dissenters and strangers with evil words, beat them up and maltreat them, and even accept their death. It should also be noted, however, that if the stupid initiative had been adopted, many jobs would have been at risk, and the lack of foreign specialists would inevitably have led to insolvencies and collapses in the economy. In addition, it would have come so far that people who come to Switzerland as short-term residents and cross-border commuters would have been much easier to put themselves under pressure than has always been the case, because these workers have always had to accept unfairly lower salaries and worse working conditions, which would have effectively worsened if the ECOPOP initiative had been adopted. Inevitably, sooner or later, working conditions would also have come under pressure as a whole, in addition to the fact that, by adopting the ECOPOP initiative, the bilateral agreements with the EU dictatorship would also have come to an end, which could already have happened through the SVP initiative with regard to mass immigration, which, however, was absolutely right and well thought out, and also brought about the right success, in contrast to the absurd ECOPOP initiative. If the ECOPOP initiative had been adopted, the bilateral agreements would have fallen by the wayside with regard to the laboriously established and regulated relations with the EU dictatorship, with the result that many jobs existing in Switzerland would have been cut and relocated abroad. A very important support for the AHV were the foreign workers and specialists, as well as experienced specialists who came to Switzerland in the last few decades and used their labor force here, because they all paid immense sums to the AHV, just like the Swiss, of course, without whom this state institution would have been financially flat for a long time. This is also the reason why all the horror scenarios regarding AHV finances have proved to be completely wrong, and the institution continues to generate surpluses. If, however, the thoughtless ECOPOP initiative had come through, and if the matter had not been so serious, one could have called it a ridiculous initiative. All these contributions from all kinds of workers working in Switzerland would have been lacking from now on, which would put the AHV in a precarious position and mean that pensions could no longer be paid out in full or only on a very small scale. And if we were already talking about the AHV, the initiative would have meant that there would no longer have been enough staff available to care for the elderly, because the nursing staff of nursing homes and spitechs, etc., are largely made up of foreign female and male workers. So everything would have come in such a way that the offers of nursing homes and spitechs, as well as of private services, would have had to be dismantled, which would have meant that poverty, misery would have risen in horrendous measure, and many old people would have been exposed to rotting. So it can only be that meaningful development work is carried out, which also brings development for care of the elderly and guarantees a dignified life for the elderly. But this can only be done by combating poverty, which is still a major problem in rich Switzerland. So we have to do a lot to stand up to poverty in our own country, and also to help the poor to a standard of living that is appropriate for their country. Instead of putting absurdly large sums of money into contraceptives in order to absurdly transport them to third world countries where they are simply thrown away and rot because they are not used. Instead of fighting poverty in Switzerland, however, ECOPOP wants to throw immense sums of money into the mud in order to reduce the birth rate in third world countries. A request that is just as absolutely illusory as the free pills to prevent pregnancy. As clever and clever as ECOPOP thinks it is stupid and stupid in reality, because how else could it be that this troop has still not understood that overpopulation can only be dealt with by introducing a strict and effective birth regulation that is ordered by the world and government? Everything else, like condoms and birth control pills, is a fake solution. This must be accompanied by a comprehensive education of the people, as well as a decisive education and health care, and the possibility for everyone to have a daily, honest and rewarding job. However, the social position and equal rights as well as equivalence, and the self-determining right of women vis-à-vis men must also apply, as must equal pay for equal work by women and men. This also means that women must also have the right to self-determination and to lead their own lives, and moreover, women than men have the flair for effective family planning and family management. Sim Ya Se Silver Star Center, the 22nd of November 2014, 1848 hours, Billy.
What I would like to talk about officially, however, refers to the four groupings that function with their flying objects on Earth. You said recently during one of our private conversations that I was allowed to tell a lot about it when I was asked about it.
That is correct, but only within the framework that no details are given, which I have explained to you.
I don't mean that either, because it's just that you know that at least two groupings definitely come from outside of our present, one of them being Earth future and the other parallel space dependent. I don't want to say any more about it, but just that, and that's only because I'm asked again and again whether you really don't have any more information about it.
Of course, we have more profound information, but our directives do not allow us to communicate it to Earth humans. If, however, you answer the questioner in such a way that one grouping refers to the future Earth and another comes from a parallel space, then this information is allowed and does not reveal any important details.
That's all I said either, because
it is a good thing and it should stay that way.
The questions have always mainly related to the observations of the unknown large flying objects that have been seen in Arizona and Belgium as well as in England, and that, yes, and I think this may be said, fall into the two groups mentioned.
This may be said, but it should be mentioned that certain of the observed flying objects were also of absolutely terrestrial origin and seen for the public's secret military aircraft.
You explained that to me, yes. Then everything necessary is said with it again. Then another thing. As you know, the rule of Christian confessors is silence with regard to what is confessed to them. I think this is good enough when it comes to things of a private nature that the people concerned create guilt thoughts and feelings of guilt from which they suffer psychological damage, which can possibly be alleviated or even avoided by confession. But if it is a serious crime or even a capital crime that is confessed, then I find it incorrect if the confessor or confessor keeps it to himself and does not report it to the competent courts or the police, whereby further serious criminal acts or even capital crimes such as murders can possibly be prevented.
So-called confessional secrets, such as those practiced by Christian priests, etc., should never appear if they are connected with serious criminal acts and deeds as well as capital crimes. If, however, in such serious cases, an act or deed is nevertheless concealed from the police or the judiciary as a result of confessional secrecy, the confessor or confessor in question is complicit in the act or deed committed, as well as in other acts and deeds resulting from what is confessed.
That's what I think too. Then I want to talk about Ukraine and the IS. As you know, the Russian military is also involved in the separatist fights in eastern Ukraine, as you explained some time ago, and this is also officially mentioned in the media. But the fact that the US government has also sent secret special units of the mercenary company Constellus holdings in the former company Blackwater to Ukraine to fight against the separatists is not made clear in the media. This also not with regard to the fact that specialists of the US Home Service, CIA, and also the FBI in the Ukraine are advising and supporting the government for the logistic and military armament, as you told me privately some time ago. But as far as the IS, that is to say the Islamist state, that is to say the IS terror organization is concerned, I am asked again and again whether its criminal leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who has elevated himself especially to caliph, is the Pied Piper, who is mentioned in the prophecies and predictions as follows with sentence 241, page 405. 1995 will also be the year in which a new powerful man slowly begins to develop, who wants to bewitch the world and gather followers around him, like once the Pied Piper of Hamelin, which is why he is called in a prophecy also Pied Piper. As you know, this prophecy forecast actually refers to this criminal Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, which I also confirmed to Marianne when she asked me about it, whereupon she also wrote an article about it for the Special Bulletin, January 2015. What I didn't say was that you and I did probability calculations together that showed a 97% probability in the relationship that all these tremendous degenerations of the IS could have been avoided if the two U.S. Presidents Bush hadn't invaded Iraq warlike through unjustified and dishonest machinations and hadn't caused the country to riot. The calculations clearly showed that Saddam Hussein would have stopped the whole thing before it could have become acute. But the fact that he was executed, which corresponded to an open murder, made this impossible, whereby the USA was to blame for the fact that in Iraq the rival faith groups began to fight each other with suicide and bomb attacks, etc., which cost tens of thousands of human lives to this day. And finally, it was only through the murder of Hussein that the IS terror militia was able to form and today carries out its blood and murderous craft. Because if Saddam Hussein had remained alive and had continued to rule the country, then he would have nipped the IS in the bud. This is not to cheer him up, because he was just as much a murderous criminal as other dictators, which also includes the two Bushes, who were US presidents, but are to blame for the disaster that has arisen and for the discord between the various faiths in Iraq, as well as for the fact that IS terrorism was able to break out and is now raging maliciously. Another question regarding this criminal terror militia is what else could be done and done against them. Because the US is just as timid in its bombardments against the IS as Syria and Iraq, etc., while other states such as Turkey are pressing themselves from doing anything. My answer, which corresponds to the matter and which I can give in each case, is that the Henok system should be used, that is to say by an effective multinational peacefighting force, with multiple personal and material superiority, as well as with all necessary weapon and technical equipment, etc., so it would not be necessary to proceed in a lax, but in a harsh way against the IS militias, which, like Al-Qaeda, as you have explained, are mainly financially supported by rich Qatari, as well as by the royal family of the Emirate of Qatar. Obviously, this does not seem to interest the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, and does not seem to bother her, because on the 17th of September 2014, she strolled with the Qatari head of state, Emir of Qatar, Tamim al-Thani, in Berlin in front of the military welcome troop. And the hammer in the matter is still the fact that Angela Merkel apparently still wants to supply weapons, whereby it can be assumed that these reach the IS terror militia. The IS terror humans, who are humans only by name, have become so radicalized, inhuman, degenerate in blood and murderous by their religious sectarian fanaticism that they lost all humanly worthy impulses. Which is why they are no longer responsive to love and goodness with any iota, nor to rational arguments. Their senses are so brutalized, wild and degenerate that they can no longer find their way back into effective reality, not even if they can be deterred from their murderous deeds by any circumstances and would be segregated and sent into exile by society. Perhaps with a few exceptions, which may be resocialized or, after serving an appropriate and expedient punishment, gradually reintegrated into society by means of instruction, pedagogy, medicine, psychotherapy, etc. Deportation to a lifetime banishment to a remote place isolated from the outside world would be the only way to protect society from these degenerated elements. These people are so inhumanly degenerate and fanatically radicalized that only violent Gewalt can put an end to their bloody and murderous craft, so that Gewalt Gewalt los ich Kite no longer serves any purpose. This means that only Gewalt against Gewalt can change something in such a way that evil is defeated and good can regain the upper hand. And this can only happen if the false humanism of those people can finally no longer penetrate who, as a result of a complete softening of life, are themselves no longer extensively viable and consequently cannot recognize and accept that in certain situations violence or even Gewalt are necessary in order to bring something degenerate back to raison d'etre. This does not mean, however, that violence should be advocated, because it should be fundamentally avoided and only used in a highly controlled manner as Gewalt Gewalt los ich Kite, as I have described it below. The creational natural laws and recommendations present that all things should never be solved and corrected with illogical Gewalt, and thus with murder and death, but only with Gewalt los ich Kite. Gewaltsamkeit is to say Gewaltsamkeit in this sense does not mean evil. Negative Gewalt and coercion, but only a logical activity by which something, such as a problem, an action, or a degeneration, is regulated in an appropriate and peaceful way. Activity in itself in the form of Gewalt los ich Kite corresponds in every form to an action which contains in itself the Gewalt of the possibility of implementation, through which as such in such a way that purposefully, logically, and positively acted, an active positive behavior is applied. According to the spiritual teachings, Gewaltsamkeit in a clear sense is nothing more than a positive activity, which can only come about because it contains strength and power and thus also Gewalt in a positive building way. Gewalt Gewalt los ich Kite means the path of passive, logical Gewalt, in other words, active Gewalt los ich Kite, in which non-violence is practiced and enforced violently or actively. This involves actively committing an act of moderating Gewalt, through which a situation is logically and powerfully rescued, whereby this does not cause damage, but a positive benefit. In Gewalt los ich Kite as active nonviolence, nonviolence is practiced and enforced violently or actively. Gewalt los ich Kite also means passive resistance, whereby passivity in this sense represents a force or a power or passive Gewalt. Because force, power, and Gewalt, even in a nonviolent passive form as resistance, represent a form of Gewaltsamkeit, which, however, is exercised in nonviolence. However, this nonviolent or passive Gewaltsamkeit must not be understood in the sense of the usual earthly human understanding of evil violence, but only in the sense of a positive, pacifying, harmonizing, balancing, uplifting, rescuing, and order-creating commitment in the form of passively resisting force, power, and influence, etc. in a logical manner. The whole thing has nothing to do with coercion, because when Gewalt los ich Kite is exercised, it is not by coercion, but by reason and forbearance, because the other side, a man or a people, is not reasonably in a position to change a situation for the better without evil violence. Gewalt los ich Kite takes place without coercion within the framework of a necessity to prevent or end something bad, so that the best, good, and useful can result from it. Gewalt Gewalt los ich Kite occurs without coercion and without the enforcement of an authoritarian act, but solely out of a necessity to prevent or end evil. The consequence of this is also to remain firm with regard to a matter, demand, or situation, neither violence nor coercion, but a nonviolent and non-coercive action, which is called Gewalt Gewalt los ich Kite. So there is no use of evil violence or coercion when people are held firm to logical and reasonable demands, or when a situation arises which makes intervention unavoidable in order necessarily to put things in order, to avert a danger to life, or in order to avert or end anything bad in some other way. Gewalt sama Gewalt los ich kite also refers to the use of physical force when it is necessary, especially when it comes to the protection and preservation of life. Well, the Gewalt sama Gewalt los ich kite cannot be applied to the IS terror militia because with them the people have degenerated so radically that their reason can no longer be penetrated. So violent Gewalt must be used against it if it is to be brought to a standstill and lifted. This means, however, that the death of human lives must be accepted, but that care must be taken to ensure that as few deaths as possible are mourned. This is achieved by capturing the degenerated IS militias and sending them into exile throughout their lives. For this, places must be chosen which are far away from any civilization, where the degenerate must be given all possibilities for life support and learning. This means that the degenerate should be given all the necessary means to earn their living through their own manual labor, but isolated and protected from society and guarded in such a way that they cannot escape. Female and male must be accommodated separately at different places of measure fulfillment and/or places of banishment. Thus, no prisons and penitentiaries, etc. Consequently, they do not produce any descendants, and they also cannot educate and infiltrate these with their fanatical radical as well as blood and murder-seeking thoughts and feelings as well as with their inhuman behaviors.
All this corresponds to what I also see and how it was the case with us Plejaren at very early times. When our ancestors applied these Henok methods, including the multinational peace-fighting troops, which finally led to the fact that all wars were ended and all criminality as well as crimes of all kinds came to an end. Consequently, we have been living for thousands of years without wars and the like, but also without any criminality and crimes. All these degenerations have become completely alien to us through the application and observance of our laws, which still exist in our country but have not had to be applied for millennia.
And as I know, you don't have any petty crime, like theft, etc., because on the one hand your moneyless system doesn't provide any reason for it, and on the other hand all Plejaren can officially purchase all desired belongings of every kind, and so also every object, etc.
That is the case, because every individual is entitled to all goods, so that one person can have exactly the same product as the other without having to pay any money for it.
But everyone has to work 2 hours a day to be eligible. That would not be possible here on Earth, because everything depends on money and work. And since we have many shy workers, useless people, criminals on Earth, who only want money on other people and therefore procure it through theft, lies, fraud, and other criminal actions and deeds, which even lead to murder, your system is for a very long time only a desirable factor with us, which may never come about.
Time will tell.
Of course, but when I consider how very bad and terrible it is today on the one hand with regard to the effeminacy and inability to live, and on the other hand with regard to the religious sectarian degeneration and the delusion of faith in God among an enormous number of people, then I am horrified. And just as today so many wars and terrorism as well as crime and contempt of man as well as fraud, brutality, jealousy, falsehood, miserliness, violence, greed, hatred, vice, lies, murder, and manslaughter, as well as racism, addictions, and depravity, etc. prevail. So it seems rather as if even a similar state would never come about as it prevails among you Plejaren. As bad, malicious, and evil as all the degenerated events on Earth have developed and taken place in modern times since 1844, and as terrifying and horrible as that in the 20th century, and especially today in the first and second decade of the third millennium, it has never been so in this world before. The boundless indifference of people to each other, as well as lies and fraud, jealousy, greed, xenophobia, hatred of foreigners, religions and opinions have risen to an unmistakable degree, as have inhumanity, warmongering and acts of war throughout the world, and worldwide terrorism, in which the IS or Islamist State plays a particularly cruel role, and even surpasses the Al-Qaeda terrorist organization. More and more people, usually young people, are going crazy, committing mass murders and massacres, beating innocent people or even killing them with blows and kicks. More and more psychologically disturbed people appear, while families are destroyed and women are brutally beaten. Women and children are forced into prostitution by traffickers, etc., but boys and girls are also sexually abused and abused by their own parents, or by priests and pedagogues, etc. Also, the organized murder business in relation to professional killers of all kinds is to be mentioned, as well as the professional mercenary murderers, who maintain mainly in the USA as well as in other states mercenary training camps and bring the mercenaries into crisis and war zones, where they murder professionally countless people, also innocent, kill, abuse, and rape women. All around there is also religious fanaticism and radicalism, for which people are also murdered, as well as without hesitation simply because some people do not like the other person's face, or anything else. But it also looks very bad with regard to the entire economy and everything else imaginable, because there is no longer any relationship on Earth that has not degenerated. And if something is said against it and it is pointed out that the whole thing in this way is not the meaning and purpose of life, then one is laughed at and stands there like a fool who roars out into the empty desert. Yes, everything possible is even done to obstruct the callers in their work. And not only by evil words, lies, and slander by malicious antagonists and know-it-alls who make themselves great with their graffiti before their fellow men and want to earn a lot of money with it. Such slimy elements exist on a massive scale, even in Switzerland, where slanderous articles and hypocritical contributions are used in their greasy journals and on the internet as a lubricant. But that is still not enough, because even sectarian groups and secret services do not shy away from even penetrating the internet and working on the computers of those who work for the effective truth, as it was done with me for years before Stefan, Piero, and Daniel could stop these attacks and interventions. You told me recently that the U.S. Secret Service, NSA, was also involved in this, and that a new system was being developed to intervene in the computers. This system is generally known as Monster Mind and should make it possible to carry out so-called cyber attacks against governments, the military and the economy as a whole, as well as against civilians, although the NSA remains unrecognized as the author. You said that such cyber attacks, if they can actually happen, if the Monster Mind system is really used in the future, could cause a huge chaos and the whole infrastructure of a country could collapse. The infrastructure includes all long-lived facilities of a material or institutional nature that guarantee the functioning of a national economy based on the division of labor. A distinction must be made between infrastructure created privately, which includes all private enterprises, etc. of all kinds, and infrastructure designed by a state, which mainly includes state investment and all state enterprises, as well as the economic order, etc. The infrastructure must be designed in such a way as to ensure that it is not used as a means of generating revenue. It is also possible, as you said, that through this system, states and their intelligence services can be misled by spreading false information that discriminates against other states, which can lead to dangerous attacks against them and even trigger wars. You also said that work is being done on developing the monster mind in such a way that it reacts independently and fully automatically to real or supposed cyber attacks and triggers dangerous and deadly countermeasures.
This or a similar system is secretly being worked on not only by the U.S. Secret Service NSA, but also in China and Russia, as well as privately in several countries.
This cannot be otherwise, because through the collective subconscious of earthly mankind the whole thing spreads, of course. Consequently, a whole series of people all over the world always come up with the same ideas, etc. at the same time, which then leads to different people all over the world working on the same inventions, etc. at the same time, and also producing products from them.
Which is inevitable.
Look here. This short article was written by two people for the journal Welt der Wunder, World of Wonders, a man named Hannes Wellman and a woman named Friederike Assmanns.
How blackmailable is Germany? On August 2nd, 2014, German security authorities come across a photo of two missing Germans surrounded by armed Islamists from the terrorist unit Abu Sayyaf. A few weeks later, the €4.4 million ransom is demanded from the German government. But from Berlin it is generally said about blackmailing terrorists the federal government will not pay a ransom. 6 weeks later, on October 17th, the hostages are free. That's all the public's going to know. There is no statement from Berlin. Experts assume, however, that the federal government, as in previous cases, met the demands of the terrorists and paid ransom. Unlike the USA and Great Britain, Merkel and co. negotiate with terrorist organizations that often finance themselves through kidnappings and blackmail. The blackmail of al-Qaeda in North Africa alone is said to have cost European governments around 100 million euros. Money to finance more murders. By the way, the budget of the German Foreign Office includes a budget item with the number 05025292222029 and the designation Secret Expenses for Special Purposes of the Foreign Office. Not infrequently, however, ransom demands are also paid indirectly and declared as development aid, for example. And in an emergency, there is still the possibility to access the budget of the Federal Intelligence Service (BND). After all, this amounts to 496.4 million euros a year.
I'm familiar with all that. Unfortunately, these truthful facts are concealed from the public.
But it is typical of the EU dictatorship, in which Merkel and her government vassals play a very important role. If one compares this with the game played by Germany's leaders in the last century, then the Third Reich sends its greetings.
Which is not to be doubted. But you speak an open word that can be dangerous for you.
Should I sit on my mouth instead of telling the truth?
This is certainly not required by anyone who has all his senses together and also grasps the truth.
That's right. The only question is whether the truth is spoken or whether only the fist is made in the bag. What I wanted to ask you, though, have you and Quetzal now done the probability calculations that you recently said you were interested in? What would have happened if my predictions made worldwide had been taken into account, and if there had been extensive action taken accordingly? Honestly, I'm interested too, which is why I'm asking you now.
We actually made these calculations and came to a very interesting result. The calculations of all your detailed predictions in comprehensive form have produced an overall average. Result of 82% probability that both the prophetic and predictive announcements would not have come true. This is the case with regard to climate change and the associated natural disasters, acts of war, criminality and crime, as well as with regard to the general degeneracy of terrestrial people, their indifference to one another, terrorism and religious sectarianism, religious hatred and xenophobia and overpopulation. This also includes all their terrible consequences, such as forced prostitution, human trafficking, human smuggling and the sexual abuse of children, as well as the inhuman behavior of young people who rob other people, beat them to death, live out a social behavior, and rage them anarchistically and asocially. But the bad consequences of overpopulation are also those you have mentioned in relation to the neo-Nazi and other extremist inhuman organizations. The murderous mercenary, but also murder in families and schools, etc., and the destruction of nature and waters, including great damage and poisoning in relation to all land and atmosphere. This also applies to the destruction of floodplains. Floodplain forests, meadows, rainforests, and nature reserves, as well as to the extinction of various soil organisms, marine life forms, bird, animal, and geological species. Very closely considered, all those factors are involved in the whole of the result of probability calculations that you have called prophetic or predictive. The 82% probability corresponds to the calculation average in relation to the fact that the prophecies and predictions you mentioned could not have come true if your remarks had been taken seriously and the necessary measures had been taken to prevent evil. In this overall result, however, the individual factors must be taken into account, since they must each be calculated as percentages for themselves, so that one or other of the factors in the prophecies and predictions show different percentages.
Thank you for your explanation, which I have eagerly awaited. 82% average, but that's a lot. It could have been avoided in only about 60 years.
That is correct, but now, Edouard, dear friend, it is time again for us to end our conversation and I leave, because I still have tasks to do. Farewell.
Thank you again, and goodbye, Ta, my friend.